introductions from me, with apologies to anyone who's new to these lectures. But they will be on, now let me get the right terminology here, they will be on the college YouTube. So if you want to hear, see the older lectures or any that you've missed, they will be available, and I think almost instantly. Perhaps takes about a day. There won't be time for questions today, I'm afraid, because some of us have to go to the Master's Lodge. But bring all your ideas, queries, disagreements to Wednesday's poetry reading, when there will be lots of time for discussion afterwards. There are some remaining handouts for lectures 1 and 2 on the piano there, so if you want one, help yourself as you go out. And so, straight in, we've had rhyme, simple and experimental, end-stopped and incredibly intellectually complex, such as I've never met before. But today we'll hear about stanzas, the architecture of stanzas, rooms and corridors. So please give a very warm welcome to Alicia Stallings.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's an honor to be here. I'm tickled to be the Clark Lecturer, and thank you to Trinity and Cambridge and everyone who's brought me here. You will notice this is the wrong slide. It's not the wrong slideshow, but I forgot to change the first slide, so it's the wrong slide, Gromit, and it's gone wrong. So this should be properly about stanzas, but it is about labyrinths. So I will just say that to write a poem is to get yourself into a pickle. That is part of the pleasure, getting yourself into the pickle and then trying to work your way out. The pickle should be perplexing and the solution surprising. That is the pleasure of the pickle. I've called this set of talks Labyrinths of Amazement, because I think of the poet as Daedalus, the builder of the puzzling maze, and the Minotaur lost in the maze, as well as Ariadne with her drop spindle in the palace, fashioning her long thread that guides us in and out again. All of them are in something of a pickle. Theseus in this allegory I leave to be the reader, I suppose. A labyrinth, like a poem, is written in lines that turn corners and are enjambed, or lines that are end-stopped cul-de-sacs, or that open into rooms or passageways, stanzas, and couplets. Both labyrinths and poems are apt to contain melancholy, misshapen monsters or ingenious princesses. The monster and the princess are, as it happens, half-siblings. They grew up playing jump rope and cat's cradle and speaking on a toy telephone made of tin cans and a length of string. Stanzas are rooms, they are places, and we move through them, or the poem moves through them, while they stand, are stands, last stands, vegetable stands, stands of trees. They are rooms of a memory palace constructed by the poet, or by the poem, chambers carved out of the limestone of the page, by the waters of language. I've spoken before that one of my earliest sort of very important childhood memories, I think I was probably around 4 years old, was an early childhood trip to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. My grandparents all lived in Louisville, Kentucky. They are buried in Cave Cemetery, the same cemetery, by the way, which is the last resting place of George Keats, brother of the poet. The summer, I was maybe 4, my sister was a toddler and deemed too young to come along on the cave tour. So I went with my father, and my mother and sister were left waiting outside for us in the blazing sun, my sister melting into an epic tantrum. The Mammoth Cave system is the longest known cave system in the world. There are 426 miles of surveyed passageways. That's more than twice as long as the next longest system, an underwater cave system in Mexico. Human activity there goes back at least 5,000 years. It was first systematically mapped and explored by an enslaved African-American, Stephen Bishop. He gave the names to many of the chambers and corridors, the rotunda, the Star Chamber, Fat Man's Misery, the River Styx, Lethe Lake, the Haunted Chambers, the Giant's Coffin, the Devil's Looking Glass, and the Bottomless Pit. To this day, I would say that my acrophobia, or in my case properly, a bathophobia, a vertiginous fear of depths, stems from climbing an enormous spiral staircase from the base of one of the caverns to the surface. I also have always had a sense of the underworld as being a real physical place. The labyrinth is real to me, and I've always been attracted to its various manifestations in dreams and literature. For instance, the great empty house Misselthwaite Manor on the moors in the secret garden. It was a long corridor, and it branched into other corridors, and it led her up short flights of steps, which mounted to others. There were doors, and there were pictures on the wall. Surely no other little girl ever spent such a queer morning. It seemed as if there was no one in all the huge rambling house but her own small self. It's also something I recognized in Ursula Le Guin's The Tombs of Atuan, in the underground tombs. All the tunnels were the same, crossing and recrossing. She kept careful count of her turnings and partings and recited Thar's directions to herself, though she knew them perfectly, for it would not do to get lost in the labyrinth. Or the statued halls with their mysterious tides in Susan Clark's Piranesi. I have climbed up to the upper halls where clouds move in slow procession and statues appear suddenly out of the mists. I have explored the drowned halls where the dark waters are carpeted with white water lilies. I have seen the derelict halls of the East where ceilings, floors, sometimes even walls have collapsed, and the dimness is split by shafts of gray light. As in a mysterious house or labyrinth or a cave, we cannot wander the rooms of the poem at random. We must go into them in the order in which they appear. The corridors are sometimes clearly marked, with one door to another flung wide open, and sometimes more mysterious clues of thought. Let's call the rooms stanzas. After all, that is what stanza means. Here is the OED etymology: Italian stanza, standing, stopping place, room, stanza. So there is this sense of a stanza as a room. I was looking at some of the definitions. Some of these are on the handout. The OED says a group of lines of verses, usually not less than 4, arranged according to a definite scheme which regulates the number of lines, the meter, and in rhymed poetry, the sequence of rhymes. I was kind of concerned about this because I actually think of couplets and tercets as stanzas, and then I thought, oh my gosh, no, they officially are not. But I was speaking to some poets last night, and they said, no, couplets and tercets are definitely stanzas. So at least from the poet point of view, we're going to count those. The New Princeton Handbook of Poetic Terms also talks about its relationship with rhyme. Obviously, you can have unrhymed stanzas, but because this is the third in a talk where I've been talking about rhymes, I will just point this out. The notion of end rhyme and the notion of stanza are all but reciprocal. The vowel and final consonant of the rhymed words are repeated, and the repetition not merely identifies line ends clearly, but also produces a sound structure, a relationship among lines. So this is getting into some of that idea of architecture. I would also say that the first slide has a terrible typo in it, which I could not fix. It's that it's at the bottom. Yes, I know that is wrong. So I like this poem partly because it's got the word stanza in it. I often teach this poem or introduce this poem to students or people who are interested in poetry when I do a unit on riddles, on writing riddle poems. And there's several Emily Dickinson poems that work quite well as riddles. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up and stop to feed itself at tanks and then prodigious step around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier in shanties by the sides of roads and then a quarry pair to fit its sides and crawl between, complaining all the while in horrid hooting stanza, then chase itself downhill and neigh like Boanerges, then prompter than a star stop, docile and omnipotent at its own stable door. Not everyone gets this right away, interestingly enough. So I was kind of looking into things that were talking about Emily Dickinson as riddles, and I came across a set of books, which maybe you all know, called Bloom's How to Write About. You know, Harold Bloom. So Bloom's How to Write About William Blake, etc. Anyway, it turns out they are not written by Bloom. They are just introduced by him and with not a little pomposity. In the How to Write About Emily Dickinson volume, actually written by Anne Priddy from 2008, Bloom begins in his introduction, after 53 consecutive years of teaching at Yale, writing more than 30 books and about 1,000 introductions, essays, and reviews, and having read incessantly morn through night for nearly 3/4 of a century, I came to realize that teaching, writing, and reading are, for me, 3 words for the same activity. He goes on to say of Emily Dickinson, she is very difficult to write about, or read deeply, or teach well, because she is vastly more intelligent than her critics, myself included. Anthony Hecht has also written about Dickinson as poems as riddles. Anna Priddy doesn't disappoint here. She suggests to the student essayist, in order to write about Dickinson's I Like to See It Lap the Miles, you should first understand that the poem is in the form of a riddle. It was not unusual for Dickinson to create poems in this way, as she enjoyed sending them to children, particularly her young Norcross cousins, poems that were to puzzle and then delight as they discover the secret. I often find that contemporary students are stumped, even when I give them the kenning at the heart of the poem that she is talking about an iron horse. But early readers of this poem were cheated out of the pleasure of puzzling it out, as Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Mabel Loomis Todd simply printed it under the title The Railway Train. They regularized punctuation as well sometimes as rhyme and meter and made some choices with alternative readings. They're often criticized for this, although I think they aren't always wrong. Luckily, I was able to find the manuscript of this online. So one of the things that you can see is she's got these little plus signs, and then she's got some things written up the side of the page, and these are alternate readings or other ideas of what she might want to do. And you will see various versions of this poem printed online or in books. So I like to see it lap the miles. On the side it says hear it, which I think might be more interesting maybe in this case than seeing it lap the miles. Instead of to fit its sides and crawl between, she suggests ribs. Maybe we should have ribs. I think I like that better. The last stanza, she's not sure whether she wants to have and or then. And here's where I think is definitely an improvement. Rather than prompter than a star, she has punctual as a star. And I think that is better because it also gets the idea of the star as a point of light as well as its promptness. So I would kind of go with that. Also, sometimes when stanzas look like they should be, sound like they should be ballad stanzas, but don't look that way on the page, I think this is sometimes more a function of her having room on her writing paper rather than trying to do something particularly radical. So one of the things about this poem is this word stanza. Is it also something of an ars poetica? The poem is a railway train. Its stanzas are rooms or carriages. One, perhaps we can even perhaps walk from car to car. But these cars are also hurtling through the world, both stationary places and movement through time, tenor and vehicle. The train is also personified, carving its way through the valleys, looking down at shanties on the wrong side of the tracks, and hippomorphized. I think of a horse named Boanerges. The reference here is actually biblical. Boanerges is a surname to James and John, and it means Aramaic, and it means the sons of thunder. It would be a terrific name for a horse. If anyone is looking for a name for a horse, Boanerges is there. And nay, like Boanerges, then punctual as a star, stop, docile, and omnipotent. So I think of a horse named Boanerges, sons of thunder, neighing. The poem, it's the iron horse, of course, and the iron horse as being a son of thunder is, I think, so perfect for this newfangled thing of the steam engine. The poem chases itself downhill before it ends, punctual as a star, and ends up at its own stable door, docile and omnipotent. Does she think this through dynamically with stanzas? I would say very much so. I would say that she is aware of the etymological connection of stanzas to rooms, and we see the dynamism in the extreme cross stanza and enjambments, and I'm going to say that in my American way, enjambments, I can't do the enjambment thing. Extreme cross stanza and enjambments, which is really not typical of Dickinson. You do get this in some poems, but it's so consistent here, where we have the step around a pile of mountains, the quarry pair to fit its sides, chase itself downhill. You'll also notice this is one long kind of sentence, and it's very paratactic in its construction. So like a railway train, it's just one thing and another thing and then another thing. If you're an American Generation X person like myself, you might think of the song Conjunction Junction. That's your function. This is a poem, I think, that's very much about stanzas and what stanzas can do. They move us through space, they move us through time, they also give us units of meaning that exist separately even while the whole thing is connected as a train. I said I would allow myself couplets and tercets thanks to the poets from last night. This is, you see the differences. This is the picture by Robert Francis, a good connection because he is another kind of reclusive poet from Amherst. Amherst seems to produce reclusive poets who are very, very good. He's an underappreciated poet. He has about a half dozen poems that belong in all the anthologies. If, as Frost says, the utmost of ambition is to lodge a few poems where they will be hard to get rid of, I think Francis could and perhaps will achieve this. This is also one of the greatest baseball poems. Poets, or at least American poets, love their baseball. The picture. So here we have stanzas, couplets functioning in this stanzaic way, which is to say as rooms and then as corridors. His art is eccentricity, his aim, how not to hit the mark he seems to aim at. His passion, how to avoid the obvious. His technique, how to vary the avoidance. The others throw to be comprehended. He throws to be a moment misunderstood. Yet not too much, not errant, aren't, wild, but every seeming aberration willed. Not to, yet still to communicate, making the batter understand too late. Another, I think, very clearly Ars Poetica poem. It makes me think of that Eliot motto, genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood. And that idea of the pitcher throwing the ball, which the batter is supposed to realize only after it has swished past him and hit the catcher's mitt. The couplets make sense because, and I think this is why poets are very fond of baseball, it's very sort of Homeric warfare kind of thing. You have two teams, but only two people are in combat at the same time. So you have the batter and the pitcher, which makes sense for the couplets. There are really interesting kind of rhyme or not quite rhyme things going here. Aim rhymes or doesn't quite rhyme with aim at. It's almost that apocryphated rhyme that we were talking about in the rare rhymes, except this is also an identity. Obvious and avoidance have some kind of sounds in common, unless avoidance is looking back at a void. Then we get to comprehended and misunderstood. They're both slightly off balance, not quite at the ends of the line. And if it's a rhyme, it's a kind of conceptual rhyme, which I didn't get into, which I would call an opposite rhyme. Comprehended is the opposite of misunderstood, and so they kind of stand as an entangled pair of words. But here, as we're getting closer to understanding what is happening, we get that wild, seeming aberration willed, where we have that para-rhyme like we might see in Wilfred Owen, where wild turns into willed. And then we finally hit that solid rhyme on communicate and too late. So it very much embodies what is happening both in the poem and in the game. Again, I'm allowing myself a couple of sets of tercets. Patricia Smith has recently just won a boatload of poems in the US, most recently for her book called Incendiary Art, which I think is a collected poems. This is the title poem from that, and a poem I have long admired for its just terrific, fizzy, contemporary terza rima. The city's streets are densely shelved with rows of salt and packaged hair. Intent on air, the funk of crave and function comes to blows with any smell that isn't oil. The blare of storefront chicken settles on the skin, and mango spritzing drips from razored hair. The corner chef's cube pork decide again on cayenne, fried in grease that's glopped with dust. The sizzle of the feast adds to the din of children strutting slant their wanderlust and cussing, plus the loud and tactless hiss of dogged hustlers bellowing past gusts of peppered breeze, that fatty, fragrant bliss in skillets. All our rampant hunger tricks us into thinking we can dare dismiss the thing men do to boulevards, the wicks their bodies be. A city strapped for art delights in torching them, at first for kicks to waltz to whirling sparks, but soon those hearts thud thinner, whittled by the chomp of heat. Outlined in chalk, men blacken, curl apart. Their blindly rising fume is bittersweet, although reversals in the air could fool us into thinking they weren't meant as meat. Our sons don't burn their cities, as a rule born as they are, up to their necks in fuel. I think just a terrific poem about a city on the point of unrest and riots, and this idea that there's this fuel, these fats everywhere, that chilling line outlined in chalk, men blacken. And, you know, the terza rima is working to pull the poem forward. We also have stanzas as kind of units of meaning, but the rhymes are these corridors that pull us through, whether it's, you know, hiss, bliss, dismiss, tricks, wicks, kicks, etc., and then landing on that couplet that kind of almost lights the match, where the rhymes are kind of wicks lighting the rest of the poem through. And of course, one of the things that stanzas can do is they are elusive in themselves. If you are selecting a stanza form that looks back to a particular poem or poet, you really can't work in English in terza rima without winking at Dante and probably the Inferno. So it's got that infernal fire to it. Quatrains. I know all of you know this poem very, very well. I will just say that I have been writing about this poem for 30 years and thinking about it for 30 years. My first sort of scholarly essay I ever published was about this. It was from 1996 when I was living in Atlanta, Georgia. And in 1996, Atlanta had been awarded the 100th anniversary for the Olympic Games. I also knew a lot of Greek people who were not happy about that. And I think rightly so. But I became really intrigued with what seemed like unlikely overlap with another cultural event from 1896, the publication of A.E. Housman's A Shropshire Lad. In that, when Housman talks about his influences, he says, "No doubt I have been unconsciously influenced by the Greeks and Latins, but the chief sources of which I am conscious are Shakespeare's songs, the Scottish border ballads, and Heine. One must always take the poet's comments on their process with a grain of salt." I think we're very used to taking poets when they're speaking in a poem with a grain of salt, but then people take the prose of poets at total face value. No, don't do that. So we know that A Shropshire Lad was originally supposed to be called The Poems of Terence Hearsay. Thankfully, Housman's friend Alfred Pollard thought this was a terrible title and suggested the title we have now. And in these poems of A Shropshire Lad, only one poet actually gets name-checked, and that is not Shakespeare or the Border Ballads or Heine, it is Milton. Malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. So we know that the speaker of the poems, Terence Hearsay, is far more sophisticated than he might appear. And when A Shropshire Lad came out, it was criticized for being false pastoral, which to me just makes no sense. All pastoral is false. That is the point of pastoral. We don't really think that, a shepherd is walking around declaiming Lycidas, spontaneously. All pastoral is false. Does it strike me as odd that there is an organized race with other towns? And I'll read this poem, even though we know it very well. "The time you won your town the race, we cheered you through the marketplace. Man and boy stood cheering by, and home we brought you shoulder high." Is that and home or as home? I think there might be a typo there. "Today the road all runners come, shoulder high we bring you home, and set you at your threshold down, townsman of a stiller town. Smart lad to slip betimes away from fields where glory does not stay, and early though the laurel grows, it withers quicker than the rose. Eyes the shady night has shut cannot see the record cut, and silent sounds no worse than cheers after earth has stopped the ears. Now you will not swell the rout of lads that wore their honors out, runners whom renown outran, and the name died before the man. So set before its echoes fade the fleet foot on the sill of shade, and hold to the low lintel up the still defended challenge cup, and round that early laureled head will flock to gaze the strengthless dead, and find unwithered on its curls the garland briefer than a girl's." I think when I did my little article on this in 1996, one of the reviewers complained that I called the poem a great poem. But I will just say this poem will outlast you, number 2 reviewer. So, does it strike us as odd that there is an organized race with other towns, or that there is a challenge cup? And what about this whole rather pagan afterlife and underworld? In fact, the poem doesn't just have some unconscious Greek influence, but quotes directly from the Odyssey. As for the games, these are perhaps influenced by the Shropshire Olympic Games, which began in Much Wenlock in 1850, and were a direct inspiration on Coubertin. So the degree of separation of To an Athlete Dying Young and the modern Olympic Games is like none. There's no degree of separation. They're complete overlap. But let's look a little bit. I'll just put here is the strengthless heads of the dead, directly out of Homer. But what are the quatrains doing? For one thing, it's rhymed in couplets, but we have these squares of meaning. We don't have any of these interesting enjambments across stanzas. Everything is very, very end-stopped. But what we do have here that stanzas do is we have movements in space and movements in time. I'm particularly interested of the movements in space. This poem starts off above the ground, where the athlete who is dead and being addressed, after he won the race, is being carried in a chair on the shoulders of the townspeople. So it starts off very high up. Now, in a coffin, he is set down on the ground. We set you at your threshold down, townsman of a stiller town. We have earth that stops the ears, so we assume that this person is buried. And then we end up in this strange below ground afterlife. So set, before its echoes fade, the fleet foot on the sill of shade. That shade there feels very Greekish, even though it means something else here, but I do think of the shades. But the foot is set on the sill. The sill sounds more like a higher up than a lintel, but maybe, or not. But when we get below the lintel and the sill, and we hold the cup up. So all through the poem, the athlete is going further and further down in the ground, and all through the poem we have shifts in time. There's that time in the past you won your town the race. Then we have another stanza, today. This is what happens. Smart lad to slip betimes, to slip soon away from fields where glories will not stay. Further down we get now you will not swell the rout. And then we get so set. So there's a sense, I think, where the stanzas are kind of performing some kind of movement through space and time. The quatrains allow us to travel in those directions. The poem also makes the athlete's death at the height of his powers a blessed event, which is a just completely Greek frame of mind. It's a very Greek sentiment. You think of Solon, who's asked, who is blessed, and he tells the story of Cleobus and Biton, two very healthy young men who drag a wagon for 6 miles to get their mother to church on time and die peacefully in their sleep, and that's their reward. The quatrains also have a way of consistently comparing the athlete to a young girl, and there is something bridal, as there's connections with weddings and funerals, in the flowers, in the procession of the townspeople, and the crossing over of the threshold. We are in Cavafy territory with a beautiful dead young man who has been Hellenized. And as we see actually in the Odyssey, very close to where we have the powerless heads of the dead. Who are the dead? Then they're gathered from out of Erebus, the spirits of those that are dead, brides and unwedded youths. So that is where we are. And here we have, I've got yellow for the time and green for things that are talking about space. I love to look at these poems together because they seem to be kind of related. This is one of my favorite Larkin poems. It's not maybe a very what people think of as a Larkin poem. I'm also a sucker for poems about horses. I mean, I don't really think I know of any horse poems that I don't like. Here we have another kind of Eponetian ode with adumbrations of ancient Greek, and it's definitely Larkin's Greekest poem. And we have stanzas here. We have larger stanzas. We have units of 6. At grass. The eye can hardly pick them out from the cold shade they shelter in. Again, we have that shade. Till wind distresses tail and mane, then one crops grass and moves about, the other seeming to look on and stands anonymous again. Yet 15 years ago, perhaps, 24 distances sufficed to fable them, faint afternoons of cups and stakes and handicaps whereby their names were artificed to inlay faded classic Junes. Silks at the start, against the sky, numbers and parasols, outside, squadrons of empty cars and heat and littered grass, then the long cry hanging unhushed till it subside to stop press columns on the street. Do memories plague their ears like flies? They shake their heads, dusk brims the shadows. Summer by summer all stole away, the starting gates, the crowds and cries, all but the unmolesting meadows. Almanacked, their names live. They have slipped their names and stand at ease or gallop for what must be joy, and not a field glass sees them home or curious stopwatch prophesies, only the groom and the groom's boy with bridles in the evening come. Some of the things that seem very kind of Greek to me, well, we have a lot of things in common with To an Athlete Dying Young. We have a cup, for instance, and we have a race. We have movement through time in the units of the stanzas. There is a sense of the ending there are things that don't feel very English in here. That sort of unhushed and unmolesting feel very kind of Greek to me. I mean, they are Larkin adjectives, but they also have that kind of privative thing going on with them. We had the rhyme is ABC, ABC. That goes throughout, and we have some lovely rhymes, fantastic things that are going on with the meter. I'm not here to talk about that today, but in the third stanza, we have that inversion. So we have silks at the start, and then we have that minor ionic and littered grass, then the long cry, which hangs out there. But I think the thing that's kind of most obvious here, we have a very Larkinesque and Jammet across stanzas. It's as extreme as it could possibly be, and the horses literally slip their names there. They have slipped their names. To me, it's a very strong effect. To do it a lot, it might not have that same effect, but you couldn't really do it without the stanzas. So I think here he really earns that kind of extreme enjambment, and you feel the horses escape at that moment. It also has that sense of death, of the athlete dying young, that not English-sounding end sentence here. Only the groom and the groom's boy with bridles in the evening come, where the verb is kind of held to the very end of the poem. People point out that bridles is a mistake. This is not how you would lead a horse out. You would do that in a halter. But obviously bridles is there partly to go with the groom. And again, this idea of weddings and funerals, and that perhaps, really it's about marrying death. But it's just one of my favorite poems, and I think wouldn't work without the stanzas. So I've talked about stanzas as trains and how they chase themselves downhill. But it's a little bit more than that. Stanzas are, where have I gone? Come back, Gromit. Stanzas are generative, offering the poet a clear path forward. The stanza form is both at the train with its coupled carriages, but it's also the track, which the poet is laying as she goes. And this is, of course, the ultimate image of that. I thought I would look briefly at one of the most famous and beloved American poems. Robert Frost knew its worth and wrote to Louis Untermeyer that it was his best bid for remembrance. And we know quite a lot about the composition of this poem, so it gives us some insight into how stanzas are generative of meaning. Although titled Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, it is written not on the darkest evening of the year at the winter solstice, but in June of 1922 at dawn. It's written towards the summer solstice. After a night of productive composition on his long blank verse poem of 413 lines, which is pastoral and satirical New Hampshire. This is not a popular poem. Even early reviewers were not thrilled with it. Irving Howe writes, the poem foreshadows the sly folksiness that would later endear Frost to native moralists, lady school teachers, and miscellaneous middlebrows. And New Hampshire ends on this note, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Well, if I had to choose one or the other, I choose to be a plain New Hampshire farmer with an income in cash of, say, $1,000 from, say, a publisher in New York City. It's restful to arrive at a decision, and restful just to think about New Hampshire. So he wrote this in one all-night broken stretch of composition. And then around dawn, he turned the page and wrote Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, essentially without stopping, which is kind of ironic. And, he just, the first stanza just came to him. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So this is a quatrain. It's a kind of Rubaiyat quatrain, which we might know from Omar Khayyam and Fitzgerald's translation. But this is where he does something kind of interesting. That went off so easily, Frost said. I was tempted into the added difficulty of picking up my 3 from the 1, 2, 4. to go on with the second stanza. I was amused and scared at what that got me into. He writes about this a lot over time. There's an indulgent smile I get for the recklessness of the unnecessary commitment I made when I came to the first line in the second stanza of my poem. I was riding too high to care what trouble I incurred. It was a series of almost reckless commitments. So they're entangled because the here would normally not rhyme with anything, that third line, but instead he generates the second stanza off of it. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkness evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. You can see a little of what is happening with this manuscript. This is just the last three stanzas. There's a little bit of not sureness at the beginning. Apparently it's based on some real events. So he had the real fact of having two steaming horses, but later decides that's not as nice as having the one single horse. He changes the horse's gender from she to he at some point. But the only other place we come in is at the end. Again, it's that third line that's the jumping off point to the next stanza. So what happens when we might be getting towards the end of the poem? What do we do there? The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. There are at least two other attempts. That bid, I give the reins a shake, but we've already had the shake rhyme, so that doesn't really work, and we've already had the reins. There's another thing, something about I have something to go for miles. He scratches both of those out and instead puts miles into the next line, which would be the fourth line, which has to have the E prime, and miles to go before I sleep. So the fourth line is actually written before the second to the last line. The last line is written first, and then there's this sense of, no, the poem is finished, and it goes backwards and fills that in. And that's how that poem completes itself. So it's a kind of interesting case. You can see also, I mean, does he think, yes, I'm doing rubaiyats like Omar Khayyam? Yes, I think he does. I mean, Frost tends not just to wear his learning very lightly, but to hide it up his sleeve like an ace. So I think it's there. And you can see that even some of the triads of rhymes are already easily available in the Fitzgerald. I think about this poem a lot because of the times being dark. It's another case of a poem where we know quite a lot about how it happened. Theodore Rothke was born in Saginaw, Michigan. He was the son of a German immigrant who was a florist who owned several greenhouses, and those images are in a lot of the poems. I think it's hard to remember how important a poem he was in mid-century America. James Dickey, writing in 1968, said that Rothke was, in my opinion, the greatest poet this country has ever produced. I don't know that he's that much read anymore. He's also sort of a cultural thing. He's quoted in the first chapter of Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, so he's very much sort of in the mix of things at a certain point, maybe not now. We know a lot about how this poem happened because there is a book called The Contemporary Poet as Artist and Critic by Anthony Ostroff, where various poets contributed newish poems and various important poet critics wrote essays on those poems, and then the poet responded. So Rothke submitted this poem. Stanley Kunitz, John Crow Ransom, Babette Deutsch, and Rothke himself respond to this poem. None of them talk about the stanza form, which was disappointing. Rothke reports that In a Dark Time was a dictated poem, something given, scarcely mine at all. For about 3 days before its writing, I felt disembodied, out of time. Then the poem virtually wrote itself on a day in summer. So that seems really very similar to what happened with Frost. Again, these are quite depressive poets, where maybe like the long brightness of the days and the contrast of that with a kind of internal darkness focus the mind, or his madness here, into, again, stanzas can be shapely vessels into which certain kind of thoughts can be poured. In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood, a lord of nature weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the wren, beasts of the hill and serpents of the den. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair, my shadow pinned against a sweating wall. That place among the rocks, is it a cave or winding path? The edge is what I have. A steady storm of correspondences, a night flowing with birds, a ragged moon, and in broad day the midnight come again. A man goes far to find out what he is, death of the self in a long, tearless night, all natural shapes blazing unnatural light. Dark, dark my light, and darker my desire. My soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Which eye is I? A fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind. So we have 6-line stanzas. They look a lot like the Venus and Adonis stanza, which is my favorite stanza form, I will just say. I wandered lonely as a cloud is in that stanza. But they're not quite, because that would be A, B, A, B, C, C. And here we have something else, A, B, B, A, C, C. Rothke often writes in similar shaped stanzas, although he also is a free verse poet, a very fine free verse poet. So he's not exclusively writing in stanzas, but certain poems come in stanzas. And I think this works very well. There's something about this shape that's like miniature sonnets, where there's the interwoven or entangled or enveloped 4 lines, sea, shade, wood, tree. And then there's a couplet, which is kind of a stopping point or conclusion, or some kind of rethinking or some kind of uniting of things. I think you definitely feel that at the end. The mind enters itself, and God the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind. It's a kind of terrifying poem, and something about the chimes of it seem to make it scarier to me. I'm not going to discuss this, although I love it, so I invite you to look at it in your free time. Again, Hardy just invents stanzas all of the time, and I don't know how many millions of stanzas. It's almost every poem is sort of in a different stanza form, and just sort of terrific. Complex stanzas, there are poems that have more than one kind of stanza in them. I think maybe The Shield of Achilles is your first example here, where you have, this is only a part of the poem, but you have images from a sort of innocent Homeric time, not that Homeric times were innocent, that are in a kind of dancey trimeter and rhyme every other line. She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble well-governed cities and ships upon untamed seas, but there on the shining metal his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness and a sky like lead. And then the modern times, as it were, that are contrasted are in iambic pentameter, and they're in rhyme royal. A plain without a feature, bare and brown, no blade of grass, no sign of neighborhood, nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. My husband and I quote that anytime we're in a kind of mall or something, nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. I will say, obviously, not all stanzas, and you might see a poem where there are units of meaning broken off into kind of paragraphs where they are different sizes, and some people will call those stanzas. I will call them strophes. Just to, for me, a stanza has to have some kind of form of regularity, and another thing might be called a strophe. I'm quite intrigued with the idea of syllabic stanzas, where we are getting away from rhyming, but we're still doing something quite intricate with the architecture of the stanza. Marion Moore is, example number 1, and she also tells us a little bit about what she is doing and how these stanzas are happening. In 1919, she writes to Ezra Pound, I have occasionally been at pains to make an arrangement of lines and rhymes that I like to repeat itself, but the form of the original stanza of anything I have written has been a matter of expediency, hit upon as being approximately suitable to the subject. So I kind of like this idea that it's approximate. Sometimes she will tinker with it, so even if she starts off with a very consistent, like 7 syllables, 8 lines, whatever, she might tweak it later if it's not suiting the poem. I kind of like this idea that it's organic. 40 years later, she also describes this to Donald Hall. I never plan a stanza. Words cluster like chromosomes, determining the procedure. I may influence an arrangement or thin it. I like that, thin it. Then try to make successful stanzas identical with the first. A lot of poets, Frost included, talk about how a poem starts one way and you just continue in that pattern. And if that's useful, you've got yourself some stanzas. This is one of my favorites, the paper Nautilus. For authorities whose hopes are shaped by mercenaries, writers entrapped by tea-time fame and by commuters' comforts, not for these. The paper Nautilus constructs her thin glass shell, giving her perishable souvenir of hope, a dull white outside and smooth-edged inner surface glossy as the sea. The watchful maker of it guards it day and night. She scarcely eats until the eggs are hatched, buried eightfold in her 8 arms, for she is, in a sense, a devilfish. Her glass ram's horn cradled freight is hid, but is not crushed. As Hercules, bitten by a crab loyal to the Hydra, was hindered to succeed, the intensively watched eggs coming from the shell free it when they are freed, leaving its wasp nest flaws of white on white, and close laid ionic chiton folds like the lines in the manes of a Parthenon horse, round which the arms had wound themselves as if they knew love is the only fortress strong enough to trust you. I had to look up Paper Nautilus and read about it because she is often starting from a lot of information and facts. I also, I recently wrote a book about poets and the Parthenon marbles, and unfortunately did not include this one, so I wish I had, but then I'm including it for you. So they're sometimes called Argonauts. I think maybe just that fact has put her in a kind of classical frame of mind. They are actually octopuses. They're a kind of octopus, which you might not expect. So that's where we have the eight lines, the 8 arms, rather. Argonauts exhibit extreme sexual dimorphism in life and size and lifespan. So the females grow up to 10 centimeters and make shells up to 30 centimeters, while the males rarely surpass 2 centimeters, and in fact, were not even thought to exist until the late 19th century. You can see what they look like here. That's her egg case, but it's this beautiful shell. This is an ionic chiton. You can see how absolutely perfect this simile is. Here is the manes of a Parthenon horse. Just wonderful visual things. What's going on with it as a, unfortunately my slide didn't turn out very well here, but the stanza form is just simply the numbers of syllables, and it goes 7 7 5 5 8 6 6. 7 7 5 5 8 6 6 7 7 5 5 8 6 6. But when we get to by a crab loyal to the Hydra, that's 9 syllables. Was hindered to succeed is 6, and then we go back into the pattern. Maybe she couldn't fit that into 7 syllables. She didn't want to end on a the, perhaps. I think that's sensible. But it's also kind of a point in the poem where something changes or breaks. It seems to have also a kind of emotional thing behind what's happening. This idea of the crab, it's kind of strange. We forget that bit, when Hercules is fighting the Hydra. He's pinched in the heel by a crab. That crab is later put up and celebrated in the skies. Even though it failed in its task, it was sort of a magnificent, noble failure. So maybe that has something to do with it. So I'm kind of intrigued by that she largely follows this pattern. but that she also breaks it. And we have that wonderful, again, extreme cross stanza enjambment. They are 7-line stanzas. You think for an octopus you might want 8, but that 8-syllable line is at the kind of peak of each stanza. And I also like the odd number here. But that close laid ionic chiton folds really put some air and light and attention onto this fantastic volta and change and visual image. I have seen a lot of terrific stanzad poems in recent publications. I think this is also in Angie Mlinko's Foxglove Wise. Just a terrific writer in terms of rhymes and stanzas and everything else. Here we have an ABC stanza. I think I talked about this a little in the extreme rhymes in the end, where she says, "Indeed, indeed, the seed I was found itself inside her like a spud, the hour my mother's embryo developed ova by nature's laws, dipped in the vitamins of blood and coming to light like a memory." So was rhymes with laws, spud with blood, embryo with memory, where we have a kind of anagrammatic rhyme. This one, I think, related to Paul Muldoon's experience. Mlinko is quite influenced by, she's like the love child of James Merrill and Paul Muldoon. Brilliant poet. This I just saw a couple of weeks ago, and it speaks to the moment. I might read this one. It's by Carl Churchway, who is a poet born, I think, 1954 in New York. Presidential Library and Museum. I think this might be the George W. Library. The fountain stammers and falls, motion activated, playing to the crowd. The tourists are already lined up, disgorged from the buses on their cells. Nearby, the field hasn't been mowed. Texas thistle, Indian blanket, wine cup. In the gift shop are swag and bling, children's books and the confessions of those who damaged the world for a day and wrote, "Now we act, now we are empires. And while you are diligently studying our reality, we will make a new reality." But the wildflowers do not care. And Caesar Augustus, who understood a thing or two about reality, loved a garden best when it was uninhabited. That was the perfection of power, for which reason he kept a fresco in his study of 2 women, one of whom gathers her hair at her nape in a knot, while the other turns away. They have met by chance, but as he sits at his desk, Augustus wonders what the women are talking about. Their bodies so slender and mortal. He really wants to know. The voices are just a low hum, like the bees in false yucca or poppy mallow. How easily they defy him. And this he understands as well. These are terrifically kind of, each stanza is rhymed in a slightly different way, but we have that kind of 6-line stanza weight up, rhyming with wine cup, mowed with crowd, falls with cells. I think it takes us through different rooms of thought. It allows us to compare certain ideas in a way that one big block of text would do less well. I'm going to close on another Rothko poem because I think even though it is in tercets and is a villanelle, it kind of counts as far as stanzas go. But it also is about how we walk through our days and our lives, but how also the poem moves and how the poet moves through the poem, the waking. And you can go online and hear Rothko reading this himself. I thought I might try to play that, but I think that might be more technology than I'm willing to risk at this time. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I feel my fate in what I cannot fear. I learn by going where I have to go. We think by feeling. What is there to know? I hear my being dance from ear to ear. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. Of those so close beside me, which are you? God bless the ground. I shall walk softly there and learn by going where I have to go. Light takes the tree, but who can tell us how? The lowly worm climbs up a winding stair. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. Great nature has another thing to do to you and me. So take the lively air, and lovely, learn by going where to go. This shaking keeps me steady. I should know what falls away is always and is near. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. In his essay on In a Dark Time, Rothke wrote, as a child, I was always a passionate cave and path watcher, curious as to where things led. The cave and the path are older than history, and the edge, the terrible abyss, equally old. And from the end of The Secret Garden, when Mary has other people to wander the house with her, they found new corridors and corners and flights of steps and new old pictures they liked and weird old things they did not know the use of. It was a curious, entertaining morning, or I will say afternoon, and the feeling of wandering about in the same house with other people was a fascinating thing. So that is how I have felt walking through these poems with you. Thank you very much.